In 1699, Scottish colonists were starving on the coast of Panama. The nearest English ports had food. They had ships. They had flour, ammunition, medicine, and credit. But the order from Jamaica was plain. Do not help them. Do not correspond with them. Do not sell them arms. Do not give them provisions. Do not supply shipping. So the Scots at New Edinburgh were not only trapped by jungle, sickness, and Spain. They were trapped by a sentence written inside the empire they had expected to lean on. That is where the Darien story turns. Not at the cannon, not at the fever bed, at the closed harbor. The Company of Scotland had built a colony whose survival depended on one political fact it never secured: that King William's English empire would tolerate, feed, or defend a Scottish settlement planted inside a Spanish imperial zone. The company counted that hope as an asset. The English colonies counted it as a liability. Spain counted it as an intrusion. The killer mechanism was credit. That sounds abstract until you put the colony on a table. A settlement survives if it has food, tools, medicine, replacement people, friendly ports, political protection, and money that other people trust. Darien had a fort. It had investors. It had ships. What it did not have was a system that could keep the fort alive after the first cargo rotted and the first settlers fell sick. Darien is often sold as the colony that ended Scottish independence. That is too neat. It turns a political and financial chain into a single dramatic blow. The records say something colder. Darien did not force union by itself. It damaged Scottish capital, humiliated a political class, exposed a constitutional weakness, and made the money terms of union more attractive. The ledger is the motif here. First it records subscriptions, then ships, then supplies, then block supplies, then debts. By the end, it records compensation. The story begins 5 years before the final evacuation, with an act of parliament that reads like a country trying to buy itself a future. On 26 June 1695, the Parliament of Scotland authorized the Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies. The act created a joint stock corporation with powers that looked almost sovereign when written on paper. It could equip ships. It could plant colonies. It could build forts. It could make treaties. It could defend trade by force of arms. For a Scottish investor in Edinburgh, this was not just a colonial adventure. It was a way to enter the Atlantic economy without waiting for English permission. The paper made it feel possible. The act also contained the first pressure point. At least half the capital was to be reserved for Scots inside Scotland. But the plan imagined wider backing. London money mattered. Hamburg money mattered. This was a Scottish company with an international balance sheet. Then the English Parliament and English commercial interests noticed what the charter meant. The East India Company and the Royal African Company saw a rival. English ministers saw a diplomatic problem. Spain saw a challenge to its American claims. William III, King of England, and William II in Scotland saw the thing every dual monarch fears: one crown's commercial ambition pulling the other crown toward war. William was the hinge in the whole machine. To Scottish promoters, a shared king could look like protection. To English ministers, the same king had to protect English policy, English companies, and a fragile European balance. The company believed Scottish legal authority could travel across the Atlantic. That was the fatal assumption. It could not. The charter could launch ships, but it could not make English governors risk war, rival companies accept competition, or Spain treat Darien as neutral ground. Before any ship reached Panama, the ledger had already changed. The intended capital was cut. English participation was discouraged. At Hamburg, company agents tried to gather European subscriptions. Sir Paul Ricaud, acting as a representative of the king in Hamburg, warned the city against entering commercial arrangements with Scottish commissioners, who, he said, had no credential letters from the king. The company read that as obstruction. The Scottish Parliament later called it an encroachment on Scotland's sovereignty. This was not only a colonial quarrel, it was a question of whether the same monarch could let one kingdom's officials choke the other kingdom's trade. The colony itself was still secret. In July 1698, 5 ships left Scotland: the St. Andrew, the Caledonia, the Unicorn, the Dolphin, and the Endeavour. The sealed sailing orders were opened after the fleet had passed Madeira. They directed the expedition to the Bay of Darien to Golden Island, and to a settlement on the mainland if the place was proper and not possessed by a European power in amity with the king. That wording was not decorative. It was a legal defense folded into a navigation order. The company knew Spain might object, so the order built its argument in advance. The place should be unpossessed by a European state, or the fleet should move on. The instructions also told the council to oblige the natives and procure their right or consent. That is the European records language. It is also where the colonial record bias gate has to open. For the Scots, Caledonia Bay looked like a strategic point on a map. For Cuna or Tule communities, it was land already inside their own diplomacy, trade, conflict, and resistance to Spain. The Scottish record preserves treaties, names, and claims of consent. It does not preserve a Cuna account of what the settlement meant in Cuna terms. Cuna leaders were not scenery around a European disaster. They were political actors in a region they understood better than the newcomers did. The Scots reached the coast in November 1608. They named the colony Caledonia. They called the settlement New Edinburgh. They built Fort St. Andrew and cleared ground near Caledonia Bay. At first, the scene still looks like a beginning. Wood is cut, huts go up, a fort rises. The colony has a council, seals, ranks, stores, arms, and trade goods. Then the place starts answering back. Food spoils in the heat. Cleared ground does not become an instant farm. Goods carried across the Atlantic do not become instant trade. Linen, shoes, stockings, combs, and small manufactured items only have value if people nearby want them on Scottish terms. The surrounding communities did not need to make that bargain. The first colonists had crossed an ocean to discover that a ledger entry is not a market. Then sickness enters the account. Dysentery appears in the records. Fever appears. Deaths mount. One modern reconstruction drawing on contemporary lists puts 76 Scottish deaths by 2 months after departure from Leith, 40 during the crossing, and 36 after reaching the isthmus. By the end of May 1699, deaths had passed 300. Picture what that means on the ground. Spoiled food, a burial place filling faster than fields can be planted, men too weak for ordinary labor, and letters waiting for ships that do not come soon enough. The disease story is true. It is just not enough. A settlement can survive sickness if it has a reliable supply line, credit in nearby ports, and political cover. Darien had none of the three. Jamaica mattered because Jamaica was close enough to help. English America mattered because English America had the food, shipping, and credit the Scots lacked. The company had assumed that a shared king and Protestant interest would translate into practical help. Governor William Beeston's order cut through that assumption. A 1700 pamphlet reproduces the Jamaican proclamation given under his hand on 9 April 1699. His Majesty's subjects were not to hold correspondence with the Scots or give them assistance with arms, ammunition, provision, shipping, or anything else. This is the midpoint turn. Until this point, the obvious explanation is disease, poor site choice, or Spanish hostility. After this point, the sharper question is different. Why did a company funded by Scottish investors build a colony that needed English colonial cooperation, but had no control over English colonial policy? Put the ledger on the table. Column 1, capital subscribed in Scotland. Column 2, supplies loaded in Scottish and European ports. Column 3, provisions expected from the Caribbean. Column 4, royal orders that made those provisions politically dangerous. The fourth column cancels the third. That is what credit means here. Credit is trust that ships will be supplied, bills honored, governors cooperative, and political promises kept under pressure. A hungry colony could not eat a charter. Company directors in Edinburgh still wrote like men who believed the system could be made to work. In April 1699, they told the Council of Caledonia that England would find it in its interest to be friendly in maintaining the settlement against foreign enemies. They promised ships, stores, men, arms, and provisions. That letter is painful because it describes the only model under which Darien could survive. Scotland raises the company, the colony holds the harbor, and supply flows from the Caribbean. Every link had to hold. None did. The first settlement was abandoned in 1689. The survivors left a graveyard and a fort. Many did not get home. Some were stranded in other ports. Some died on the voyage. One ship alone made the return to Scotland. Then the second expedition arrived. This is the cruel timing of Darien. A second fleet had sailed before the full news of the first failure reached Scotland. More than 1,000 people crossed the Atlantic toward a colony that had already broken. In November 1699, they found New Edinburgh deserted and overgrown. Imagine one man from that second expedition stepping off the boat. He expects smoke from cooking fires, voices from huts, a working fort, proof that the plan has held. Instead, he sees abandoned clearings, damaged shelters, and a settlement that looks less like a beginning than a warning. They had not sailed into a young colony waiting for reinforcement. They had sailed into the evidence. The company model required confidence. So the new settlers tried to rebuild confidence out of ruins. They reoccupied the site. They restored the fort. They prepared for Spanish attack. In January 1700, the Scots and indigenous allies attacked the Spanish post at Tubacanti. The attack gave the company a medal later. It did not give the colony a supply line. Spain now answered as an empire, not as a rumor. Spanish correspondence preserved in the Archivo General de Indias records the administrative language of removal, preparations, support for Juan Pimienta, and the success of the enterprise. The wording is bureaucratic. The effect was physical. The Scots could win a skirmish. They could not win the strategic equation. They were hungry. They were sick. Their local alliances mattered, but could not replace Atlantic credit. The English colonies were closed. The company in Scotland was too far away. The Spanish had time, soldiers, ships, and a clear imperial interest in making the settlement fail. This is what we know. We know the company had Scottish legal authority to plant colonies under stated conditions. We know the sailing orders sent the expedition to Darien. We know its defenders argued native consent and lack of Spanish possession. We know English colonial proclamations blocked assistance. We know Spanish authorities organized removal. We know the second colony left in April 1700. This is what we do not know. We do not know how Cuna leaders described the agreement in their own political language. We do not know every calculation inside William's councils. We do not know whether a larger state could have made the same site succeed. What the ledger can answer is narrower and stronger. The company spent as if a Scottish charter could buy Atlantic power. It could not. The point of no return was not one battle. It was the moment the company sent the second expedition before the first failure had been absorbed into policy. That fleet did not correct the assumption. It doubled it. At Fort St. Andrew, the remaining Scots faced the visible part of the collapse. Spanish siege pressure, sickness, short supplies, and exhaustion. The final agreement allowed them to leave. Some accounts place the formal surrender at the end of March, with evacuation completed by 12 April 1700. The exact paperwork varies by source tradition, but the last confirmed point is clear enough for this episode. Caledonia was abandoned in April 1700. After that, there is no Scottish colony in Darien. There are ships trying to survive the Caribbean, shareholders waiting for news, pamphlets assigning blame, graves in Panama, and account books in Scotland. The legend says Darien killed Scotland's independence. The records say something more specific. Darien damaged Scottish capital, humiliated a political class, exposed the weakness of the Union of Crowns, and made the financial terms of political union more attractive to men who had lost money or represented men who had. That is not the same thing. A slogan kills the sequence. The sequence is the case. In 1701, the Scottish Parliament's address to the king named the grievance, plainly. It complained that England had frustrated subscriptions worth about £300,000 sterling, and that English plantation proclamations had helped cause the loss and ruin of Caledonia. Read that as a source, not as a verdict. It is a Scottish political document written after failure, by men with reasons to frame the disaster as injury. But it is also evidence of how the failure was understood by the people who had to turn loss into policy. They were not saying simply that the land had been unhealthy. They were saying the constitutional arrangement had made Scottish trade vulnerable to English decisions. The union negotiations later turned that vulnerability into money. In January 1707, Scottish parliamentary minutes placed payments to proprietors of the African and Indian Company ahead of other public debts out of the sum named in Article 15 of the Treaty of Union. 398 £285 and 10 shillings sterling. The equivalent was not only Darien compensation, but company proprietors were explicitly inside the payment structure. The ledger returns for the last time. In 1695, it recorded subscriptions, who would buy a future. In 1698, it recorded cargo, what the future would be made of. In 1699, it recorded block credit, which ports would not help. In 1700, it recorded debt, what the future had cost. In 1707, it recorded compensation, what political union could settle that Scottish capital alone could not. There are competing explanations for Darien because all of them have evidence. Disease mattered, food rotted, dysentery and fever weakened the colony before Spanish troops could decide its fate. Spanish military response mattered. Spain treated the Scots as intruders. Planning mattered. Patterson's entrepot trade did not exist because a Scottish company wished it into being. But those explanations become sharper when placed under the funding model. Disease becomes fatal when replacements, medicine, and food cannot reliably arrive. Spanish hostility becomes fatal when the colony has no great power shield. Bad planning becomes fatal when the plan has no spare capital and no diplomatic margin. That is why the owned angle holds. The Darien Scheme did not fail because one external force struck it down. It failed because the company booked English protection as if it were subscribed capital. It was not subscribed capital. It was a political hope, and when tested, it did not pay. The surviving records are still tilted. Company papers tell us what directors ordered. Scottish pamphlets tell us how grievance became argument. English proclamations tell us how governors protected imperial policy. Spanish archives tell us how removal became administration. Modern scholarship reminds us that Cuna and Tule communities were actors in this place before the Scots arrived and after they left. The absent source is the Cuna account from 1698 to 1700 in its own voice. That absence changes the ethics of the story. It prevents us from narrating local consent as if a Scottish paper settled the matter. It also prevents the opposite simplification, as if indigenous communities had no agency and only received European actions. The more honest version is sharper. Cuna leaders had their own diplomacy, enemies, and reasons. The Scots entered that world thinking they had found a strategic vacancy. They had not. Darien's tragedy is not that Scotland tried to become England and failed. That is another tidy line. Darien's tragedy is that Scotland tried to solve a constitutional and commercial problem with a colony. The colony then exposed the same problem in a deadlier form. Scotland could raise money but not enough power. It could charter a company but not command the Atlantic system around it. It could plant a fort but not make English governors feed it or Spanish governors tolerate it. Here is the author's verdict. Darien was a settlement designed as a financial instrument and exposed as a political dependency. The Company of Scotland did not merely run out of food. It ran out of the fiction that a Scottish charter, an English king, and a Spanish-claimed coastline could coexist long enough for investors to be paid. The system failed before the fort did. That is why the ending should not be the colony that killed Scotland's independence. It should be the ledger that showed what independence could not buy. In April 1700, the Scots left Caledonia Bay. 7 years later, the old Scottish Parliament voted itself into a new kingdom. Between those two dates sits a column of numbers: subscriptions, ships, blocked credit, graves, debts, and compensation. The map shows Panama. The ledger shows the system.